Hello, I'm Dave Caudill, and I've written a book recently called Expertise in Crisis, the Ideological Contours of Public Science Controversies. I'm a lawyer and a law professor at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. And my teaching and my scholarship has involved the field of evidence, particularly scientific evidence in the courtroom, and presenting scientific knowledge to lay people, to jurors who are not trained in science. During the COVID pandemic, I became interested in the so-called crisis of expertise, the idea that there are large parts of the community in the United States who do not trust consensus science. And I started looking into the culture wars and that aspect of the culture wars where scientific knowledge becomes politicized. People maybe take whether they believe in the efficacy of masks during COVID or whether they believe in vaccination. That became something that was identified politically in the culture wars. The left and the right, right-wing conservatives often had a group of people who were suspicious of consensus science, while maybe those on the left were confident in what government scientists were saying. I looked into this, and a few things that I came up with that are not particularly new is, first of all, that there is a cultural distrust of science, a group of people who don't trust consensus science. That's not new. The idea that science itself is somewhat provisional and tentative and often makes mistakes, that's not anything new. Social studies of science have been showing that for years. But and then also the fact that we should probably trust consensus science, even though it's not perfect, even though it changes. It seems to be the best kind of knowledge we have. So that's not particularly original in the book. But what I do in the book is look at maybe the way communities can communicate with each other. The idea that if we live in two different worlds, if we have two different sets of beliefs and two different sets of beliefs about science, maybe we should view those two communities as communities of believers. Maybe we should almost make a religious analogy. I make the analogy with the Reformation, when in Holland in the 1600s, when Catholics and Protestants completely distrusted each other, had two completely different views of things, and were incapable of communicating with each other, basically just identifying the other side as evil and wrong. And I see the same thing in the culture wars, where I see people just looking at the other side and thinking they're completely wrong. The idea of how do you deal with somebody who doesn't have the same views on scientific matters as you do, and it's probably not a good idea to wear a t-shirt that says trust science, not morons. If all you're doing is calling the other side a bunch of idiots, there's not going to be any communication. And so a lot of my book is about science communication, about how perhaps we could do better in the culture wars if we tried to understand each other, understand each other's perspectives. There's a part of the book that discusses anthropology of religion. An anthropologist going into a religious community and trying to understand what it's about does not have to become a believer in that community, but does have to understand their perspective and does have to understand the way that they think. And so if we view the two sides in the culture wars with respect to consensus science as two different communities who have a set of beliefs that are in conflict with the other community, maybe we can look at that and say, I need to, in order to be able to convince somebody perhaps to believe in consensus science, the best way is not to call them an idiot. The best way is probably to understand where they're coming from and where they're getting their fringe views of science, and try to talk to them on that basis.